Okay, let's pick up. Ooh, that's too loud. Let's pick up where we left off last time, just as a reminder for those who are interested in following the case of Phineas Gage. I recommend Macmillan's book. But what I want to do is to turn our attention to more modern research that is inspired partly by the case of Phineas Gage, which seemed to indicate that damage to the frontal lobe would produce changes in personality and social behavior in this individual, but also by more recent advances in cognitive neuroscience that seem dedicated to the proposition that there are discrete locations in the brain that serve particular mental functions. And for most of the evolution of cognitive neuroscience, people have been looking at non-social mental functions, like modules for language or modules for visual perception or modules for memory, like the hippocampus might be. But there have been some proposals from social psychologists that there might be similar kinds of modules that are specifically geared towards social cognitive functions. One such proposal comes from a psychologist at Harvard, Howard Gardner, who's really a developmental psychologist, and he's been very interested in various kinds of intelligence. A lot of intelligence testing theory has been predicated on the idea that there's really just one form of intelligence, what Charles Spearman called G for general intelligence. But Gardner has argued that, in fact, human intellectual function can be broken down into a series of intelligent faculties that may have little or nothing to do with each other. First, linguistic intelligence, verbal intelligence, the kind of thing that's assessed allegedly by the verbal portion of the SAT. Logical mathematical intelligence, the kind of intelligence that's ostensibly tested by the math portion of the SAT. Spatial intelligence, musical intelligence, even bodily kinesthetic intelligence, the kind of thing that makes some people really, really good dancers. He thinks that's a special form of intelligence. But for our purposes, his two most interesting proposals is there's a specific intrapersonal intelligence, by which he means some people are really, really, really good at gaining access to their own internal emotional lives. They're able to read themselves very well. They have a very good sense of what their motives are, what their feelings are, what their beliefs are, and other people just really don't have very, very good access to that, he thought. And then, similarly, there are individual differences, he thinks, in what he calls interpersonal intelligence, which is basically the ability to read other people, the ability to make sense of what's going on in our social interactions. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different forms of intelligence, which Gardner argues may have nothing to do with each other, so that there really isn't a general intelligence as such. There are these more specific kinds of intelligence. Well, how would we know? Well, Gardner has suggested that there are a number of different ways in which we can try to figure out whether these forms of intelligence are really separate from each other. One is to think about what he calls identifiable core operations. And he says, for example, with respect to interpersonal intelligence, there are some things, some functions that we perform in our social interactions that just don't have any counterpart in non-social domains. So, for example, impression formation, person perception, or causal attribution. He also thinks that these kinds of intelligence can be separated psychometrically by various kinds of tests. And whereas there's a whole bunch of tests out there that are used to assess individual differences in analytic intelligence or logical mathematical intelligence or verbal intelligence, there are, in fact, very few tests out there that have tried to assess social intelligence. One is what's known as the Vineland test of social maturity. It's used mostly with children. It's used mostly with people who are mentally retarded. But it's a test of social intelligence that seems to be pretty much uncorrelated with individual differences in more analytic intelligence. Then he argues there are certain kinds of experimental tasks that might be used to reveal these forms of intelligence, like tasks that involve the detection of deception. You'll remember from our presentation earlier in social perception that some people are really good, or some people appear to be really good at detecting deception, at catching liars. That would suggest that they have a form of intelligence that allows them to do that. That's different from other kinds of things. Exceptional cases, again, there are some individuals that we know that are really good at this. Gardner's the prime example of a person with good interpersonal intelligence was President Lyndon B. Johnson, who was famous for his ability to read people and manipulate people and get them to do what he wanted. But for our purposes, the method that's of most interest is isolation by brain damage. And Gardner has argued that there are certain kinds of brain damage that seem to dissociate interpersonal intelligence from the other forms of intelligence. For example, in Alzheimer's disease, you have people who are demented in terms of their analytical intelligence. They really seem to lose IQ points. But most people with Alzheimer's disease, at least in the early and medium stages of Alzheimer's disease, don't lose their ability to get along with people. Similarly, mentally retarded individuals with Down syndrome are very low in IQ. That's part of the definition of mental retardation. But Down syndrome people are typically very nice, very affable, and get along with them very nicely. They don't seem to have any problem with that. And then there's a famous case by the Russian Soviet neuropsychologist Alexander Luria Zazetsky, who again seemed to lose his cognitive forms of intelligence, verbal, analytical intelligence, but didn't impair his ability to get along with other people. By the same token, turning this around, you've got some cases of brain damage that seem to impair social forms of interaction, but not the more analytical kinds of intelligence. We've already talked about Phineas Gage, and although Gardner does, like most other writers on the topic, exaggerate Gage's social deficits, the fact is Gage did have some social deficits. There's another dementing illness, Pick's disease, that seems to affect social functioning and emotional functioning before it affects cognitive functioning, and that's true for frontotemporal dementia as well. So here you've got typical neuropsychological method, taking an instance of brain damage and noticing that it impairs some functions but spares other functions. That's evidence in neuropsychology for the idea that these functions are served by different brain systems. Here's another example of people who are trying to figure out what kinds of cognitive modules we might have that serve specifically social functions. Here's work which we're going to talk about in more detail next week by Simon Baron-Cohen, an English psychologist, who argues that social interaction depends on our ability to read each other's minds, to figure out what other people want and believe and feel, and that mind-reading ability can be broken down into a relatively small number of components. He thinks of these as cognitive modules, and he argues that each of them is served by a particular brain module as well. So again, just like in the doctrine of modularity, particular tasks performed by particular mental modules, each of which is associated with a fixed neural architecture. Well, what are these? Baron-Cohen thinks that we've got what he calls an intentionality detector, which helps us to interpret people's behavior in terms of their goals or their desires. Thinks we have an eye direction detector, a module that first detects the presence of eyes in the environment, but also has some ability to figure out where those eyes are looking, specifically, is an eye looking, or eyes looking at you, or are they looking at somebody else, right? That's what's known as the eye direction detector. And as you can imagine, that's pretty important for social interaction, right? To know whether when somebody's paying attention to you or not. Then the third module that Baron Cohen talks about is what's known as the shared attention mechanism, which basically has to do with a person's ability to follow another person's gaze or follow another person's pointing. If I look over here, many of you will start looking over here as well. That's called the shared attention mechanism. And the idea behind the shared attention mechanism is if you look where I'm looking, you'll see what I'm seeing. That is to say, you'll have the same perceptual experience that I'm having. And then finally, we'll talk about most next week, is what is known as the theory of mind mechanism, a module, cognitive module, that allows us to infer other people's mental states from their behavior, what their beliefs are, what their feelings are, what their goals are, and so on. Yeah?
I guess my question is, have they tried to, compare people who have more of an innate understanding of this versus people who may have done poor on recognition testing and tried to teach them these methods? Like, what's the gap?
That's a really interesting question about whether these things are innate or not. The idea here is that they are innate, okay? Although it will become clear by the end of this lecture that there's definitely a learning a component to these kinds of things. But his idea, Baron Cohen's idea, and really the idea behind all of these searches for brain modules, is that they've developed in the brain by virtue of evolutionary selection, and so that they are in some fundamental sense innate. Right? That's the general idea. Here's another example. This is from Dan Goleman, who's a PhD psychologist who turned science writer. So for those of you who don't want to go into academia but still want a PhD, he can be an inspiration for you. He's a very good science writer. He suggested that we have a somewhat larger set of modules in what he calls the social brain, subserving large-scale functions like social awareness, that is our ability to read other people, and social facility, that is our ability to manipulate other people. Perhaps the most interesting of these proposals for specifically social cognitive modules comes from a philosopher and cognitive scientist named Ray Jackendoff, who has argued that we have a number of central processing modules that go way beyond things like language and perception. He argues that we probably got a brain module that does nothing but handle categorization tasks, another one for spatial cognition, determining spatial relations among objects, another one for representations of our own bodies that handles that. Jackendoff is a music theorist in his spare time. He thinks we have a specific brain module that underlies musical ability. But again, in present context, he argues that we have a number of brain modules that are dedicated to various aspects of social cognition, dedicated to trying to figure out who other people are and how they relate to us in various ways. Let me spend just a little bit more time on this. Well, why does he think that? Well, in the first place, Jackendoff says we do have social cognition. We do perceive other people. We do make inferences about other people's beliefs and all of that. But if you think about it for a second, very little of that knowledge can be uncovered from the physical details of the perceptual stimulus. Okay, you all look very different. Okay, but you've all got the same thing that you want. You want to have a decent class hour, or you want to learn something here and all that. There's nothing that I could recover from, very little that I could recover from your physical appearance that would allow me to figure out what your goals and desires and beliefs are. He also argues that in the social domain we have a number of specialized input capacities. That is, we seem to be able to recognize faces and recognize voices really easily. We seem to be pretty good at reading emotion from the faces of people, like as in Paul Ekman's work. We seem to be disposed to inferring people's beliefs and desires from their actions. If I throw something from one side of the stage to the other, you infer that I wanted to do that, not just that somebody grabbed my hand and made me toss this object. We seem to do these kinds of things really naturally, and that suggests to him that we have these abilities in some innate fashion. And then finally, very interesting thing, says there are certain aspects of social cognition that take developmental priority. And one of the interesting things is developmentally, we learn proper names of objects before we learn their broader social categories. So you recognize Susie, your sister, before you really have the concept of sister, and you recognize Sandy, your dog, before you really have the concept of dog. And he argues that we probably have an innate ability to distinguish between animate and inanimate objects, and also a propensity to individuate. Okay, so that's the general idea here. And he makes some other arguments. He says, look, there are certain aspects of social cognition that are just universal. For example, we talked about a couple of these. Across all cultures, people make distinctions between in-groups and out-groups. There's no culture on the face of God's green earth where the people don't do that, okay? Similarly, across cultures, people process information about kinship. Different cultures may have different kinship categories, but every culture makes distinctions based on kinship. And he argues that the reason for that probably is that we have evolved brain modules that perform those kinds of functions. Okay, so that's just another argument for having specific faculties of social cognition. And in fact, Jackendoff has argued in detail that there's a specialized module for face recognition, another one for affect detection, another one for making a distinction between animate and inanimate objects, and possibly for things like kinship and in-group and out-group perception as well. With the advent of relatively inexpensive, it's still fabulously expensive, but it's relatively inexpensive brain imaging technologies, people have gone off to begin the search for brain modules that are dedicated to various aspects of social perception. Nancy Canwisher in 1997 argued that the fusiform gyrus, right there, roughly where the temporal lobe meets the occipital lobe, is dedicated to face recognition. She calls it the fusiform face area. Downey and his colleagues have argued that there's another area at the junction of the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe, right about there, that involves a kind of mind reading, theory of mind the processing, becomes active when people try to reason about other people's beliefs and desires. And then Sachs and Canwisher is very involved in this kind of thing, have argued that there's another area in the parietal cortex that is particularly involved in processing information about the movement of bodies, which is a pretty social kind of thing. So this was early on. Even more recently, in the paper that you've read for this week, Matt Lieberman at UCLA has argued for the existence of about 21 dedicated social cognitive modules in the brain. Here's the list of them. This is in the chapter that you read. So for example, here's this theory of mind area, and there's another area near it that makes dispositional attributions. And then over here is an area that serves impulse control in the frontal lobes. And down here, there's an area that kind of helps us to control ourselves in various ways. The whole list is there for you to read. But the point is, between 1997 and 2007, a period of 10 years, the list of dedicated social cognitive modules in the brain revealed through brain imaging jumped sevenfold from 3 to 21, and it's been another 7 years, and there have been more discovered since then. So again, social psychologists taking methods derived from cognitive neuroscience, putting people in magnets mostly, and having them perform various kinds of social cognitive tasks, have begun to reveal what appears to be a whole toolkit of brain modules that are devoted to various aspects of social cognition. Here's, just to take another example, here's an area that's devoted to moral decision making, seems to be activated when we make judgments about what's right and what's wrong. Interestingly, here's another area, almost on the other side of the brain, that's also involved in making judgments about right and wrong, and that suggests that maybe this process isn't quite finished yet. It would be really nice if the moral judgments made by this area differed somehow from the moral judgments made by that area. All of these studies use the same methodology. They ask people to perform some specifically social cognitive task while they're in a magnet, an fMRI machine, or a PET scanner, or whatever, and then they try to identify areas of the brain that are activated when people perform this task. And if they do identify areas of the brain that are activated when people perform this specific task, they then identify the area of the brain with the task. Clearest example of that, again, is this fusiform face area, this area right here, that seems to be activated whenever people are engaged in recognizing faces. And to kind of show you some of the issues that come up in social neuroscience, I don't want to just run through a catalog of all 21 of Lieberman's modules. That's something you can just read for yourselves. Let's look specifically at this argument for a dedicated brain area that processes information about faces. If ever there was going to be a specifically social cognitive module in the brain, it would involve the face. The face is the primary social stimulus. It's pretty much the first thing you see when you come out of the womb. We read faces. We identify individuals from their faces, typically. We read people's emotions from their faces. We distinguish among people by their faces. The face is the primary social stimulus. Okay? So it would make sense that if any specifically social cognitive module ever evolved in the brain, it would be one that had to do with the processing of faces. So the proposal that there is such an area makes sense. It's the first thing you would look for if you wanted to find a social cognitive module in the brain. And again, there have been proposals around that there are such things. Remember, we discussed the work of Bruce and Young, who argued that there was a specific module in the brain dedicated to face recognition, enabling face recognition to be dissociated from other kinds of social cognitive tasks like affect detection or whatever. So even as early as then, we had this kind of thing. There is neuropsychological evidence that points to the fusiform area as a face recognition area, and this comes from a particular form of neuropsychological syndrome known as visual object agnosia. These visual object agnosias are really interesting because people who suffer from them can describe objects that are shown to them, but what they can't do is name the object. They don't recognize the object as familiar, and if you ask them just to say, well, how would you use this, they can't do that either. They can describe it. They can say there's a cup here, and it's kind of cylindrical, and it's got this thing on it. But if you ask them, what is it, they can't tell you. If you say, well, can you show me how you use it, they can't do that either. Visual object agnosias are often characterized as you've got a normal percept, you can perceive the world okay, but you can't connect it up to meaning. Yeah. No, they can't. They can't, because they can't show you how it could be used. They can't use the object either. They just don't know what to do with it. It's really interesting. One form of visual object agnosia, one that's interesting to us as social psychologists, is what's known as prosopagnosia, which involves a specific deficit in recognizing faces. These people can perceive faces. They see them perfectly well. They can describe them perfectly well. But what they can't do, essentially, is put a name to a face. They can't say, that's Chancellor Dirks. They can't say, that's President Obama. They can't say, that's whoever it is. And what's interesting about this is that there are certain cases here that are called pure prosopagnosia because the person's deficit is specific to faces. The person performs fine if you give them some object that's not a face that they have to recognize, but they have a lot of difficulty. They simply can't recognize faces. And we now know that this prosopagnosia is associated with damage to this area of the brain known as the fusiform gyrus. Right there, there's the occipital lobe, temporal lobe, frontal lobe, parietal lobe. Right there at the base of the brain, actually tucked up underneath. It's hard to see in a lateral view. Here it is, right there. Where the temporal lobe abuts the occipital lobe. Okay, and that has led some people to suggest that this is actually an area of the brain that is specifically dedicated to processing information about faces. The first person to make this argument was the late Justine Sergent, a neuropsychologist at McGill University in Canada, but it's been most vigorously promoted most recently by Nancy Canwisher, who's a psychologist at Harvard. And here again, just so you can get a better idea, there's the fusiform gyrus right there. Okay, you see it in this scan. Okay, and this seems to be activated when people are recognizing specific faces. Okay, so let's review the bidding for a second. What Bottomer discovered was that there were people who couldn't identify faces as familiar, but who could identify other kinds of objects, coffee cups and books and automobiles and all of that. What Sergent and Canwisher discovered was that, in fact, this particular area of the brain, the fusiform area, is activated when people are asked to identify faces that should be familiar to them. Okay, but is not activated when people are asked to perform another kind of visual perception task. There's a problem with